Lovats. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we return to our interview with Noam Chomsky. I spoke with him last week in the courtyard of the King Juan Carlos I Center at New York University. I asked him about WikiLeaks.
I don't see anything that's come out in WikiLeaks that was a legitimate secret. I mean, WikiLeaks is a service to the population. Assange should get an award for Presidential Medal of Honor. The whole WikiLeaks operation has helped inform people about what their elected representatives are doing. That should be a wonderful thing to do, and it's interesting. I mean, nothing really sensational has come out, but it is interesting to know, for example, that when the Obama administration effectively supported the military coup in Honduras that kicked out the democratic government and put in what amounts to a military-backed government, that they knew exactly what they were doing, because the embassy we learned from WikiLeaks that the embassy in Honduras had presented a detailed analysis right at the beginning of the coup that expelled the president and said, yeah, this is unconstitutional, it's illegal, and so on. So yes, they knew exactly what they were doing when Obama and Clinton were saying, well, it's not that bad, and everything's going fine, and so on. Or for example, when Ann Patterson, the ambassador to Pakistan, those are some of the most interesting revelations. She supports U.S. policy in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but she did warn that U.S. policies of assassinations, pressures on Pakistan and so on carry a real danger. They carry the danger of radicalizing Pakistan, and where the opposition to these policies is enormous, and maybe creating even a situation where its nuclear facilities would be accessible to jihadi elements. So it's creating a terrific danger. In fact, Pakistan is way more dangerous to U.S. security than Afghanistan, which is nothing. Well, it's good to know that they were getting that information. They were getting that information from analysts. People who write about it and know about it. But the fact that they were getting it from the embassy is significant when you think about how these policies were escalated. And in fact, it's quite striking that the policies are undertaken in ways which it's almost as if they're consciously trying to increase the threat. And so take, say, the assassination of Osama bin Laden. I mean, I'm a small minority of people who think that was a crime. I don't think you should have a right to invade another country, apprehend a suspect. Remember, he's a suspect, even if you think he's guilty. Apprehend him after he's apprehended and defenseless, assassinate him, and throw his body into the ocean. Civilized countries don't do that sort of thing. But notice that it was undertaken at great risk. The Navy SEALs were under orders to fight their way out if there was a problem. If they had to fight their way out, they would have gotten air cover and probably intervention. We could have been at war with Pakistan. Pakistan has a professional army. They're dedicated to protecting the sovereignty of the state, very dedicated to it, and they wouldn't take this lightly. A war with Pakistan would be a utter disaster. Some huge nuclear facilities laced with radical Islamic elements, and not a big part of the population, but they're all over. But they did it anyway. Then right after it, when Pakistan was, totally outraged, carried out more drone attacks in Pakistan. Almost, it's kind of astonishing when you look at the planning. They're quite apart from the criminality.
What do you think of the U.S. increased reliance, President Obama increasingly using drones to attack people in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and beyond?
Good comment about that made by Yoki Drazen, he was the military correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, is now for some other outfit, military analyst. He pointed out accurately, this is after the killing of Osama bin Laden, which he approved of, but he said that there's an interesting difference between Bush and Obama. I mean, I'm now paraphrasing in my own terms, not his terms, so the way I would have said it is, if the Bush administration didn't like somebody, they'd kidnap them and send them to torture chambers. If the Obama administration decides they don't like somebody, they murder them. So you don't have to have torture chambers all over. Actually, that tells us something else. Just take a look at the first Guantanamo detainee to go to trial under Obama. Trial means military commission, whatever that is. The first one was a very interesting case and tells us a lot. The first one was Omar Khader. What was his crime? His crime was that when he was 15 years old, he tried to defend his village against an attack by U.S. forces in Afghanistan. So that's the crime, therefore he's a terrorist. So he was sent to Bagram and to Guantanamo, 8 years in these torture chambers. Then he came up for trial under Obama, and he was given a choice. You can plead not guilty and stay in Guantanamo for the rest of your life, or you can plead guilty and get another 8 years. So his lawyers advised him to plead guilty. Well, that's justice under our constitutional law president for a 15-year-old kid defending his village against the attacking army. And there was nothing said. The worst part is there's nothing said about it. Actually, the same is true of the al-Awlaki killing. This American cleric in Yemen who was killed by drones. He was killed. The guy next to him was killed shortly after his son was killed. There was a little talk about the fact that he was an American citizen. You shouldn't just murder American citizens. But the New York Times headline, for example, when he was killed, said something like, West celebrates death of radical cleric. Well, first of all, it wasn't death, it was murder. And the West celebrates the murder of a suspect. He's a suspect, after all. There was something almost 800 years ago called the Magna Carta, which is the foundation of Anglo-American law, that says that no one shall be subjected to a violation of rights without due process of law and a fair and speedy trial. It doesn't say if you think somebody's a suspect, you should kill him.
Do you think the media has improved at all as you assess it over these decades right now?
I think it's better than it was. I'm not a great fan of the media, but I think if you compare them to, say, the 50s and 60s, it's considerably improved. Because there's competition and because people have access to other information, it puts pressure on the establishment media? I don't think so. In fact, it's more monopolized than it was then. I think it's because the country's changed. It's a much more civilized country than it was. I mean, if you think back what things were like in the 60s, first of all, you have to take, say, women's rights. I mean, throughout American history, up till quite recently, under law, women were basically property. They were the property of their fathers and their husbands. I mean, in the early years of the country, the argument against women voting was that it wouldn't be fair because then the husband would get 2 votes, since obviously the wife has to do what she's told, And in fact, until the 1970s, women didn't have a guaranteed right to serve on juries because they were considered, couldn't do that kind of thing. If you go back to the universities in the early 60s, say my university, it was, obedient to deferential white males. All of that has changed. It's changed in many other respects. You mentioned gay rights. I mean, there would have been, couldn't even utter the words not many years ago. There are laws against sodomy, and up until recently, maybe still. It's the same in England. There's just a dramatic case there. I don't know if you've been following it, but one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, Alan Turing, who was also a British war hero, he's the one who pretty much decrypted the German codes and saved Britain from attack. Well, he was a homosexual. In the early 1950s, that's against British law, early 1950s, he was subjected to treatment to cure him of this disease. And the treatment was so grotesque, he finally committed suicide. Well, that's a long time ago. That was 1954. Prime Minister Cameron was just asked whether time has come to issue a belated pardon. It's the 100th anniversary of his birth. And he said, no, he violated British law. No pardon for that. So, okay, we basically killed this war hero, great mathematician, because he was violating British law. Well, that's changed a lot. Maybe not in Cameron's office, but and it's changed in many ways, and that's affected the media because the people working there, a lot of them went through these experiences.
Noam Chomsky, what gives you hope?
Well, lots of, right here, for example, take the Occupy movement. That's very striking and dramatic. Or take where we are today. We're at a meeting of NACLA, North American Congress on Latin America. What's happened in Latin America in the last 10 years is just spectacular. I mean, in the last 10 years, for the first time since the Spanish and Portuguese conquerors, that's half a millennium, Latin America has freed itself, substantially freed itself from Western domination and control, meaning mainly U.S. In fact, there was just a very dramatic example of it just a couple of weeks ago at the Cartagena Hemispheric Conference, which is very important. It was kind of suppressed here with some Secret Service scandal, but there were really interesting things that happened. This is a hemispheric conference. There were two major issues. There was no declaration because you couldn't get agreement. The two issues were Cuba and drugs. The whole hemisphere wants Cuba to be admitted to the hemispheric, to the summit. The U.S. refused. U.S. and Canada refused. On drugs, practically the whole hemisphere is pressing for decriminalization because they're suffering the brunt of they're the ones who get hit in the solar plexus. The demand for drugs is here. The supply of arms is here, and they suffer from it. So they want to move towards decriminalization. U.S. and Canada refuse. U.S. and Canada are isolated in the hemisphere. And in fact, there's a new organization just formed about a year ago, CELAC, which formally excludes the U.S. and Canada, includes everyone else. It's quite possible that may replace the Organization of American States, which is U.S.-run. One sign of it is that the U.S. has been essentially kicked out of its military bases in South America. They're also moving towards dealing with some of their internal problems, which are severe. The other thing that's exciting there is the role of popular movements. There are mass popular movements of indigenous people, working people, others who've just been, who've been extremely successful in substantially changing policy. That's of historic significance.
So the Occupy movement gives you hope. Latin America gives you hope.
Arab Spring. There are a lot of interesting things happening in the world. But I think consciousness is changing in a lot of things. I mentioned the attitudes of kids 18 to 24, which is pretty bad. But I think that can be changed, too.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned scholar, dissident, and linguist. He's taught more than half a century at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's institute professor and professor of linguistics. I interviewed him last week here in New York at the 45th anniversary celebration of NACLA, the North American Congress on Latin America, where he was being honored. Noam Chomsky is the author of over 100 books, most recently Occupy. If you'd like to get a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org.